Good morning, class. This is ECON 353 macroeconomics class. Today is February 24th, Thursday. The class will move on to chapter 8 of your textbook. The topic is aggregate expenditure and equivalent output. Chapter 8 is the most important part of this course. So how our national income is determined. In chapter 8, we discuss the Keynesian theory of consumption, investment, and determination of equivalent output. So here is the order of today's video clip. 1. The aggregate expenditure identity. 2. Marginal propensity to consume and average propensity to consume. 3. Aggregate expenditure model. 4. Case study and paradox of thrift. 5. Autonomous investment. 6. Expenditure approach and savings approach. Here are video clips.
The first question that any economic system must answer is this: what goods will be produced? That is, what combination of the possible goods and services will be produced in this economy? In order to summarize the possible combinations of goods and services that can be produced, the economist needs a tool, and the tool that we use is called the production possibilities frontier. Production possibilities, what it's possible to produce. The production possibilities frontier shows all combinations of goods and services that it's possible to produce in this economy given its resource endowment, that is the amount of capital, labor, and raw materials available, and given its technology, that is its know-how for transforming raw materials into final goods and services. The production possibilities frontier will show you the maximum amount of one good that the economy can produce, given the amount of other goods that it's already producing and given its resource and technological constraints. I'm going to draw now a production possibilities frontier for a sample economy. And because this is macroeconomics, instead of using two goods like apples and oranges, we're going to use aggregate goods, that is, goods that are actually a broad class of a type of good. The two types of goods that we'll use are consumption goods and investment goods. Let me first define. A consumption good is a good or service that provides immediate satisfaction for its own sake. For instance, an example of a consumption good is clothing, or food, or perhaps entertainment, or medical care, things that provide you with satisfaction right now. These are the consumption goods. And on the horizontal axis of my production possibilities graph, I'm going to measure the quantity of consumption goods that are produced in this economy. Now, you're asking, well, what is this? Is this shirts? Is this medical care? Is this food? What is it? Well, what it actually is an aggregate. We've made up some kind of measure of consumption goods in general. Think of this as the number of baskets of consumption goods. And in each basket, there's a little bit of food, a little bit of clothing, a little bit of medical care. And the numbers here on the horizontal axis represent the number of those baskets, an aggregate measure of consumer goods available in this economy. On the vertical axis, we're going to measure the quantity of investment goods. Investment goods are sometimes called capital or tools. These are goods that produce other goods. An example is a sewing machine. Another example might be a drill press. Another example might be a factory. Anything that actually is valuable because it produces other things is a capital good or a tool or an investment good. I'm going to use here the letter I to stand for investment goods. And something you'll learn very quickly in macroeconomics is that when we say investment, we're talking about the spending, the purchases of businesses. Investment is business spending. And on the vertical axis here, I've calibrated numbers that represent the overall quantity of investment goods produced in our economy. So once again, we're thinking of this as baskets, representative measures of tools. So there's a little bit of sewing machine, a little bit of drill press, a little bit of factory in each of these baskets. And we're going to produce 25, 50, 75, 100, or so forth. So on my two axes, I am measuring the quantities of things that are valuable in our economy. On the horizontal, we have consumption goods represented by the letter C, and on the vertical axis, we have investment goods or capital or tools represented by the letter I. Now, what are our production possibilities? That depends. It depends on the quantity of resources we have, land, labor, tools to use, and it depends also on our technology, our know-how, or our ability to translate these raw materials into final goods and services. I'm going to represent these possibilities first with a table of numbers. We can call this table the production possibilities schedule. As you look at these numbers, you'll see the maximum quantity of consumer goods that can be produced for any given quantity of investment goods produced. So for instance, whenever we're producing 100 bundles of investment goods, we're using up all of the resources in our economy, and we have nothing left to produce consumer goods with. We can take that piece of information and move over into our graph and find a point that shows us our output when we devote all of our resources to the production of investment goods. And that's this point right here, 100 bundles of investment goods and no consumer goods at all. That's a point then on the vertical axis. The next combination listed in the table has 75 investment goods and 100 consumer goods. Let's think about what this means. If we are willing to give up 25 bundles of investment goods, we will free up land, labor, and capital. We will free up resources that will allow us to produce 100 units of consumer goods. That is, these resources that were being used to produce tools have an opportunity cost. You can either have 25 extra tools or you can have 100 new consumer goods. The opportunity cost of this 100 units of consumer goods is the 25 tools that we must give up in order to produce them. We stop producing the tools, that frees resources that are then diverted into the production of consumer goods. And we can show that as this new point on the production possibilities frontier. The combination here is 75 tools and 100 bundles of consumer goods. Let's continue this line of thinking as we look at the next combination on the schedule, 50 units of investment good and 150 units of consumer goods. Now, the opportunity cost of getting an additional 50 units of consumer goods is 25 tools. Give up 25 tools, and now you can get an additional 50 units of consumer goods for a combination of 150 consumer goods and 50 investment goods. Well, notice what's happened here. The first 25 tools we were willing to do without bought us 100 consumer goods. The next time we give up 25 tools, we only get an additional output of 50 consumer goods. What's going on? Well, this is a matter of increasing opportunity cost. That is, the first time we cut back our production of sewing machines and other tools, we did so by freeing the resources that are best suited for the production of clothing. That is, we took the resources that could most easily be transformed into consumer goods, and we let them go first as we reduced our output of tools. Now, if we want to reduce the output of tools further, we're taking resources that aren't quite as well suited for the production of consumer goods as the first set. So maybe the first time we let go of cloth, we let go of labor that was talented in the production of clothing, and we sent them over to produce consumer goods instead. Now we've got workers that know a lot more about tools and not quite as much about producing clothing. And whenever we move them from the tool sector into the consumption sector, they don't add as much additional output as the workers that we first transferred. So you can see we have an increasing opportunity cost because some resources are better suited to the production of tools and other resources are better suited to the production of consumer goods. Let's continue this logic by looking at the next point in the schedule. 25 units of tools and 170 units of consumer goods. Now, whenever we let go of another 25 units of tools, that is, whenever we cut back the production, our output of consumer goods only increases by 20 units. This is because the resources that are being freed are less well suited to the production of consumer goods than the resources that were freed in the earlier stages. And finally, whenever we reduce our output by that final 25 bundles of tools, that is, when we cut our investment output to zero, we increase our output of consumer goods only 10 more units, up to 180. This is the quantity of consumer goods that we can produce when all of the resources of our economy are diverted into the production of consumer goods. This last set of resources is quite well suited to the production of sewing machines and not very well suited to the production of clothing. That's why we got only a small increase in consumption for a relatively large reduction in investment. So here are 5 possible combinations of consumer and investment output. This is our production possibilities frontier. But of course you can imagine that we could produce lots of combinations in between. Instead of reducing output by 25 tools, we could reduce it by 10 or 5 or 1 or 0.5. Therefore, if we connect these dots, we get all the possible combinations of tools and consumer goods. That is, all the possible combinations of investment goods and consumption that are possible to produce in our economy given its resource endowment and its technology. So another way of thinking about this is, if we want to produce 80 units of clothing, that is 80 bundles of consumer goods, then given our resources and our technology, the most we can produce in investment goods is going to be, it looks like from this picture, about 80 units of investment goods. That is, go up to the production possibilities frontier and see the maximum quantity of investment that you can produce for a given quantity of consumption. Now, this production possibilities frontier tells us several things about economics. That is, we can see many of the basic concepts of economics in this picture. The first thing we can see is the reality of scarcity. That is, there are some combinations of investment and consumption that we'd like to have in our economy that simply aren't possible. For instance, 120 units of consumption good and 100 units of investment, that's a point up here that lies outside the production possibilities frontier. This would be a very nice point to achieve, but it's simply not achievable given the resources and the technology that our economy has to work with. So points outside the production possibility frontier indicate the reality of scarcity. Points inside the production possibility frontier, like this one, 40 units of consumption and 50 units of investment, represent the possibility of unemployment or underemployment. If we're not using all of our resources, or we're using them in uses for which they are not especially well suited, then we're not going to be producing the maximum amount of investment goods that can be produced for a given amount of consumption. So points within the production possibility frontier represent unemployment or underemployment. The downward slope of the production possibility frontier reminds us of opportunity cost. If you want more consumer goods, that is, if you want to move outward on the horizontal axis, you have to move downward on the vertical axis. To get more consumer goods, you have to give up investment goods. There is a trade-off. More of one good means necessarily less of another. And finally, notice that the curve gets steeper as we move down it. That's because the slope of the curve represents opportunity cost. Remember from slope, rise over run. In this case, the rise is the reduction in investment goods that's necessary to give you the run or the increase in consumer goods. 25 investment goods given up may buy you 100 consumer goods at one point on the curve, but only 10 consumer goods at another point on the curve. As the curve gets steeper, the opportunity cost of additional consumption is getting larger. That's because not all resources are equally well suited to the production of tools and consumer goods. Some resources are better at tools, and we keep them in the production of tools until the very end. Others are better suited for the production of consumer goods, and we move them into the consumer good production as quickly as possible as we start increasing output in that sector. So the bowed shape, the outward bowed shape of the production possibility frontier indicates increasing opportunity cost. Now, what happens if we change the things we held constant at the beginning of this story? When I drew this production possibility frontier, I held constant the resources of this economy and its technology. What happens if we change one or both of those factors? Well, when you draw this curve, remember, you're holding those things constant. You're saying what happens to our production of investment goods if we increase our production of consumer goods, ceteris paribus, that is, holding constant resources and technology. But if you're going to change resources and technology, that is, if you're going to change the original assumptions that were made when you drew the curve, you've got to draw the whole curve over again. When you change those basic assumptions, you've got to go back and redraw the relationship. So let's start with an example. Suppose we have an improvement in technology that allows us to produce a lot more tools for a given quantity of consumer goods. That is, suppose there is a technological change that allows us to make tools more simply. Maybe some advance in computer know-how or the discovery of a new mineral that's useful in making tools. And let's suppose that this technological advance applies to the production of tools, but not to the production of clothing. That is, if we use all of our resources in clothing, we can still produce the same quantity of clothing as before. But if we produce tools now, we're going to get more tools than before. That is, the production possibility frontier is going to lie outside the original. Our possibilities have increased, and these increased possibilities favor the production of tools. That is, with these new possibilities, you can make tools more easily than before. Notice the way the curve shifted. The shift is biased in the direction of tools. That's because this technological progress favored the production of tools. The same picture would apply if we got new resources that were useful in the production of investment goods, but not particularly useful in the production of consumer goods. Let's consider another case. What happens to this curve over time? Because, see, this is a dynamic story. If you make the decision to devote some of your society's resource to the production of tools, you're increasing your resource base. If you don't eat everything now and you plant some of it, you're going to be able to grow more food tomorrow. So whenever you make a choice to be at a point like this on the curve, a point that involves a balance between the production of goods for consumption today and goods that can be used as tools to make more goods tomorrow, then your production possibilities frontier is going to shift outwards over time. And we call this outward shift economic growth. That is, as you accumulate tools, you increase your ability to produce output in your economy. And this accumulation of tools advances the production possibilities. It means you can make more of everything over time. This is called economic growth. And we imagine that economic growth is probably no more likely to favor consumption as it is to favor investment. That is, the tools you make will help you make clothing as well as sewing machines tomorrow. So the whole curve shifts outwards. Some economic growth is biased in one direction or another, but in general, there's no reason to assume that the investment in tools doesn't increase your production possibilities broadly, that is, increase your ability to make output in both sectors in the next period. Suppose there is a war that affects this economy. How would the production possibilities change? Looking at the diagram, we can imagine that the output in both sectors would be reduced. That is, if war occupied or destroyed some of the resources in this economy, the quantity of consuming and investing goods that can be produced is going to be reduced. So the curve would shift inward like this. How would immigration affect the production possibilities frontier? Suppose talented labor were to find its way into this economy. What would happen? We can show that as an outward shift in the production possibilities frontier, the ability to produce more of all goods than before. What would happen now if a technological change occurred that increased the ability to produce consumption goods but didn't change the ability to produce investment goods? We would show that as a biased shift in the production possibility frontier that increased the possibilities only in one dimension. The production possibilities frontier then summarizes the capability of this economy to produce goods and services. And one interesting thing to notice is that it's possible to talk about the production possibilities frontier in terms of these aggregates. The trade-off between enjoying consumption today and using your resources to make tools so that you can enjoy even more consumption tomorrow.
Hi, I'm just in the neighborhood, and I have a lawn mowing service, and I was just wondering if you would like your lawn mowed.
Oh, well, I usually mow my own lawn, thanks.
Well, it looks, you know, kind of tall out there, so I just thought...
Well, I've been kind of busy this week. I haven't really gotten to it yet, but...
You know, it's only $35, and I'm going to school right now, and I could really use it for my chemistry books, and...
$35? You know, I think maybe I'd pay $15 to do it.
These are really expensive books.
Oh.
$25?
Is that your lawnmower?
Yeah.
You really use that thing?
Yeah. Oh, it works. I mean, it's guaranteed to cut lawns.
$20.
$20? Cool. $20.
Great. So I gotta see this. Given how much I hate to mow my lawn, I think I just got a good deal. But I feel a little bit guilty. I mean, is she going to report that income to the Internal Revenue Service and pay taxes on it? Most likely, she's a participant in what economists call the underground economy. The term underground economy refers to any economic activity that takes place outside of government supervision. And usually this activity is undertaken by its participants to avoid the law or to avoid paying taxes. One example of an underground economy are the activities that surround illegal trade, traffic in narcotics, or people who drive illegal immigrants across international boundaries. Another set of underground transactions are those undertaken expressly to avoid paying taxes. So when people get paid in cash, like she is, chances are she's not going to report that income to the government. And if she doesn't, she's part of the underground economy. Another example of underground economic transaction is barter. If my neighbor comes over and rakes my leaves and I go over and paint his living room, our trade involves value for both of us. But if we don't report this value to the Internal Revenue Service and pay tax on this in-kind income, then we're avoiding taxes and are part of the underground economy. Now, is this something that we should be worried about? The underground economy may account for a relatively large chunk of the economic output of the United States. Some economists estimate that somewhere between 3% and 20% of gross domestic product comes from this kind of underground transactions. In the United States, this is even a relatively small amount of our economy. A country like Italy, we might be talking about upwards of 1/3 of GDP coming from underground activities. So, is it a problem? Well, first of all, anytime a transaction like this occurs, taxes are being avoided. Consider then that in 1992, the Internal Revenue Service estimated that about $100 billion worth of tax revenue was lost because people didn't pay taxes on activities like this one. By 1998, the amount lost in taxes was estimated to be as high as $200 billion, and that amount will probably increase as the underground economy grows. So not only is tax revenue lost, but also there are resources tied up in the enforcement of tax laws, and the more people turn to underground activities, the harder police and the taxman have to work to make sure that we get the money to fund government programs and pay for public goods like streets and street lights and schools and so forth. So as people avoid their taxes, there's less revenue to provide the goods and services that government provides for us. Then there's all of the wasteful activity that people do to try to avoid the police, like hiding their lawnmowers and doing this activity after dark and so forth. Next thing you know, however, she's going to need protection for her property rights, or someone's going to find out that she's doing this activity on the sly and threaten to blackmail her and turn her in. Then we've got organized crime surrounding this activity. People who are tough, people who are strong, forming kind of their own law around underground activities, as happened around alcohol in the U.S. around the turn of the last century, and as happens around narcotics today. So we get that kind of stuff. In the end, there's a lot of waste that surrounds underground economic activity. On the other hand, there's a lot of innovation that surrounds it as well. People who don't yet have the resources to go and apply for a license and deal with all the government regulation can start their own simple job by getting a lawnmower and going out and mowing lawns for people. Of course, they are putting themselves in a position of risk and liability, but at the same time, they are making a living. And she's probably going to be discovering some new things about mowing lawns that she can share with other people. Innovation is likely to occur as well. So, while the underground economic activity may create greater dispersion of wealth, meaning that some people pay taxes and other people don't, this kind of activity can also level the playing field by giving anybody a chance to get in and try to make their way. So what can we do about the underground economy? If we're concerned that, in fact, we're losing too much money in taxes, we really have two alternatives. One is to increase enforcement and go after people like her and her lawn business and make them pay their taxes. That involves a big expenditure of resources. The second thing is simply to legalize activities and bring them under the auspices of the government so that they can be taxed more thoroughly, as happened with alcohol around the turn of the last century. Now, legalization isn't going to change her lawn business. Maybe we should have more enforcement to make people like her pay taxes. On the other hand, if she weren't here, I'd have to mow the lawn myself. So you see, I'm in a quandary. The underground economy has costs for society, but it also has benefits. We've said before that the gross domestic product can be calculated by two different methods. The method that we looked at carefully before was the expenditure method, adding up the spending plans of all the sectors of the economy to calculate the total output of the economy. But there's another way to calculate the output of the economy, and that's looking at all of the income that's created when sellers do these transactions with buyers who are spending money. This is called the income approach. And income is just as good a way of calculating gross domestic product as looking at spending. Suppose now it's your job to figure out the relationship between income in our economy and the gross domestic product. How would you add up all the income that's received, and what adjustments would you have to make the connection between what we commonly call income and the total market value of all final goods and services produced in our economy in a year? Well, let's start with the money that's available for you to spend, the money that's available for households to spend. What do we have to do to get from our disposable income to some broader notion of our personal income? What you have to do first is take your disposable income and add back in all of the money that you've paid in personal income taxes. Now you've got personal income, the money before taxes that's available to spend. Well, how do you get from here to a broader measure of national income? What are the other factors that influence the money that's available for people when they make spending decisions? The first thing that you're going to want to do is to subtract out transfer payments, any money that the government has given you. And you're going to want to add back in all of the things you gave the government. That is, add back in Social Security contributions, the taxes that businesses paid, corporate income taxes, add back in undistributed corporate profits, that is money that business kept for itself, and this gives you what we call national income. This is the total amount of money that was received in the United States by the factors of production. Let's divide that into its various categories, that is, who actually received this income. The biggest category was employee compensation. That adds up to about $7.4 trillion, money that was paid to labor. The second component is proprietors' income, that is, profits, and that adds up to about $654 billion. Rent on land adds up to about $142 billion, and interest payments to people who have lent capital adds up to about $476 billion. Finally, corporate profits adds up to $879 billion. Those are the components of our national income. Those are the payments that the factors of production receive as a result of the transactions that are done when goods and services are trading hands. That's where the gross domestic product winds up. But we still aren't all the way back to a connection between income and gross domestic product. There are other factors that we have to add back in before we've accounted for all the value that was created in our economy. The next thing we have to do is we have to add back in the indirect business taxes that businesses paid in the course of doing these transactions. Sales and excise taxes, tariffs, and other taxes that were levied on the transactions. That money was paid off to the government. It was siphoned out of the circular flow. We've got to put it back in order to make a connection between income and gross domestic product. The second thing that we have to account for is depreciation. That is, some of the goods and services that we produced in our economy simply went to replace other goods and services that had worn out. In particular, plant, equipment, other things that businesses use, tools that wore out with use have to be replaced. And if we add that depreciation back in, then we get a more accurate measure of the total output of the economy. And finally, net foreign factor income, that is the money that we paid to foreign factors operating in the United States that helped produce the GDP but weren't counted in national income when we added up the receipts of American labor, capital, entrepreneurs, and landowners. So let's see now if we can show this very clearly. If you take gross domestic product, that is the total output of the economy, Y, and you subtract from that the capital that depreciated, then what you're left with is a measure called net domestic product. This is the output of your economy after you've set aside some of it to account for depreciation. If you take net domestic product and you subtract from that the income that was paid to foreign factors, as well as indirect business taxes that were paid, the sales taxes, excise taxes, customs duties, and other things, then what you have left is national income. And national income means the receipts of American entrepreneurs, that is business owners, labor, capital, and landowners. Then if you take national income and you subtract from it Social Security contributions, corporate profits taxes, undistributed corporate profits, and you add back in transfer payments, then what you have is personal income. That is what people are able to spend on goods and services, but you still have to subtract personal income taxes before you get to the final measure of disposable personal income. That is what people are able to spend whenever they go to the grocery store. So you can see it's a complicated matter getting between income and output. But if you're careful and you are consistent in taking account of all of the ways in which income leaks into and out of the circular flow, you can see that there is a connection between income, that is what you receive, and spending, that is what you buy at the store. Both of these are valid methods for calculating gross domestic product. Now, as we go forward, we're going to be thinking more often about the expenditures approach, because we're going to be interested in how these different components of spending are related to employment, output, prices, interest rates, and other variables in the macroeconomy. But keep in mind that any time I show you the letter Y, I am referring to output, which is someone's income and someone else's spending. Y can be used interchangeably to mean these three things: the output of an economy, the total spending on output, and the income received by factors of production in that economy. The gross domestic product is the market value of all final goods and services produced in a country in a given period of time, usually 1 year. Let's look at some gross domestic product figures from 1998. These numbers measure the real GDP in each of the countries. Real meaning that the prices used are those from 1996, and the quantities of output used are from 1998. Using these numbers, the United States had a real GDP of about $8.75 trillion in 1998. Japan's real GDP is about $3.8 trillion. France's is about $1.4 trillion, and so forth. Looking at these numbers, You might ask, well, what should I make of these? What do they mean? One thing you can do with these numbers is look at how they change from year to year, and that's the information that's reflected in the growth rate of real GDP. The growth rates are now shown in the table, and as you look them over, you immediately notice that Mexico has a more rapid growth rate than does the United States. Well, what does that tell you? What it really tells you is that Mexico's growth rate is more rapid because Mexico is starting from a smaller base. A given absolute change in output in Mexico translates into a larger percentage change because Mexico's starting point is a smaller real GDP than the GDP in the United States. The given change in the United States translates into a smaller percentage. Whenever you hear people in the press talking about economic growth, they're usually talking about the change in real GDP, or the percentage growth rate of real GDP. Again, though, what do you make of this? When you hear that a country has a rapid growth rate, does that mean that the standard of living of its citizens is improving? Or that Mexicans are getting better off 3 or 4 times as fast as our people who live in the United States? Well, this depends on how you interpret the numbers. Let's divide all of the numbers in this column by the populations of the respective countries. That gives us per capita GDP, per capita real GDP in 1998. First thing you notice is that 2 countries, Switzerland and Japan, have higher per capita real gross domestic products than does the United States. Well, what does this tell us? Would you rather live in Japan or Switzerland? Is the typical Swiss or Japanese better off than the typical American? This, once again, depends on what the numbers are telling us. Gross domestic product numbers began to be compiled in the middle of the last century, that is around the time of World War II, when countries were concerned in measuring their productive capacity. That is, how many machines, how much output could be brought to bear quickly on the war effort. What was the productive capacity of our economy? Nowadays, however, these numbers are used to represent the ability of goods and services to provide satisfaction to the citizens of an economy. That is, there's usually an implicit link made in the press when we're talking about these numbers between the gross domestic product of a country and its standard of living or its quality of life. But is that an obvious link? Does the gross domestic product really tell us whether people in a country are better off or not? Let's consider several qualifications to the gross domestic product that will occur to us on reflection. That is, why might the gross domestic product not tell us what we want to know about quality of life in a country? The first problem with the gross domestic product is that there are things that are important to our standard of living that are left out of its number. The first is leisure. Does it matter if the gross domestic product has increased by 20% if we're all working so hard that we're tired and unhappy? That is, one of the things that we value is our vacation time, our time to sit and read a book. And yet leisure time does not show up in any form in the gross domestic product. In fact, on the contrary, you can argue that when gross domestic product increases, it could be because people are working harder or working longer hours, and that has to be traded off against their lost leisure. So leisure activities don't show up in the number. A second qualification is environmental quality. We're all concerned about clean water, breathable air, and beautiful landscapes, and yet none of these have market values that show up in the gross domestic product. Therefore, whenever business activity increases the final value of goods and services traded in markets, but at the same time diminishes the quality of air and water, we get an increase in the gross domestic product, but perhaps a reduction in our standard of life. The third question is about goods that are not traded in markets. What about child care? What about production in the household? What about meals put on the table and redecoration of houses and things like that through effort that occurs at home? Well, all of these things make our life better, and yet they don't show up directly in the gross domestic product because they're not traded in markets. Another concern is the quality of products. Think about television sets today compared to television sets 40 years ago. Not only are the television sets of today of higher quality and more fun to watch and providing better and clearer pictures, but their prices are also lower because technological progress has made it easier to produce these goods than back in the 1950s. Television sets are better and less expensive, but This doesn't show up in the gross domestic product because the gross domestic product doesn't provide explicitly for changes in the quality of products. Finally, there's this whole question of goods and services that are traded that never show up in official statistics at all because people are doing them through barter or other informal transactions that they are trying to avoid paying taxes. The underground economy may be as much as 10% of our gross domestic product. That is, people engaged in informal activity on which taxes are not paid and records are not kept. So all considered, there's a lot of activity that's increasing our standard of life that never shows up in official statistics. Therefore, the gross domestic product may understate our true quality of life. On the other hand, it may overstate our true quality of life because there's a lot of expenditure that gives us no satisfaction. Consider one example, a lock and key. I bought this at the store to lock my locker at the gym so that no one would steal my clothes. Well, did this make me better off? Well, given that there's crime, I'm now protected, so I worry less. But do I want to live in a world where I have to spend a lot of money on locks and keys and security systems and car alarms? Also, because of the stress of modern life, we may spend more money on medication. Also, because of the difficulty of maintaining relationships in a stressful business world, there may be more divorce lawyers. All of these expenditures wind up increasing gross domestic product, but they don't necessarily make us happier. Therefore, our quality of life may be lower, even as our total spending increases. Another concern with per capita real GDP as a measure of quality of life is that it doesn't include other things that make for a good society, such as the distribution of income. If one person has a whole lot of money and everybody else has nothing, you might get a high average, that is a high per capita GDP, and yet the income distribution is all messed up. One person has everything, and therefore there are a lot of people who may be living in misery and poverty. Not only are we concerned about the people who are miserable and poor, but we're also concerned about what kind of society that makes for. Do you want to live in a society where a very small number of people are very rich, while most people are discontent because they can't meet their basic needs? Some measure of the income distribution might be important to a real measure of quality of life, but we don't get any of that from our gross domestic product statistics. Another concern is infant mortality. How many children are living out of childhood? What about adult literacy? What about life expectancy? All of these measures are important. What about the status of women in your society? What about educational opportunities? All of the things that we think make for a good society, none of them show up in this one-dimensional number that we call gross domestic product. Therefore, there are a lot of efforts now on the part of other groups to conduct measures of quality of life that are taking as their point of departure the gross domestic product, but trying to adjust it for the things that it leaves out and other things that it should include, or things that should be omitted. One of these is the United Nations Quality of Life Index, which looks at educational opportunities, infant mortality, adult literacy. And when it does, it reorders the country. The United States slips down in the list, and other countries that might surprise you rise up higher. Another interesting effort is on the part of a group in San Francisco called Redefining Progress. Redefining Progress has conducted what it calls a Genuine Progress Index. The Genuine Progress Index includes non-market production. That is, it tries to estimate the amount of value that's created from childcare and production in the household. It also treats the depletion of natural resources as a reduction in our capital. It tries to take explicit account of the amount of pollution that's created, and it knocks out of the GDP expenditures that are simply trying to clean up messes that we created in the process of production. Other things that it does is to take account of the income distribution and adjust the GDP downwards when the income distribution becomes more skewed. And it considers the drawback of living on foreign assets. Are we becoming more dependent on foreigners lending us money? The Genuine Progress Indicator has actually been declining since the mid-1970s. That is, if you take out the money that we're spending on locks and keys and security systems and divorce lawyers, and if you adjust for the amount of pollution that we're creating, according to Redefining Progress, our real standard of living has been falling since the mid-1970s. Well, there you have it. A concern about how to measure quality of life and standard of living. And it turns out that the gross domestic product, which was created to measure your capacity for conducting war, not surprisingly, doesn't always do a great job of telling you whether your people are better off. When you read the newspaper and listen to the radio, you'll hear a lot about inflation. The inflation rate is 2.5%, or inflation is rising, or bond traders are afraid of inflation. The government has a lot of different measures of inflation. Inflation means the general increase in the price level in the economy, the rate at which all prices are rising. But how does inflation affect me? Why should I care about it? When I went to the grocery store, I bought some bread, and my favorite loaf of bread now costs $1.25. Well, that's a big increase in price over last year. I know because I kept the tag. Last year, this bread only cost $1. This is a 25% increase in the price of my favorite sandwich bread in 1 year. This is a lot faster than the rate of inflation as I'm reading it in the newspaper right now. My question is, at what rate are the prices rising that I care about? I don't especially care about the price of aluminum or the price of electricity. I care about what's happening to the prices of the goods and services that I purchase on a regular basis. So, the government has constructed an index that focuses its attention on the prices that I care about, the prices that households pay for the goods and services that they most frequently buy. This is an index that answers the question, at what rate is the cost of living rising? And it's called the Consumer Price Index. The Consumer Price Index is interesting to consumers because it's made up of the prices that are most important to us. That is, the stuff that we typically spend most of our money on. Let's look at how the Consumer Price Index is constructed. We begin with a basket of goods and services that represents what the typical household spends its money on each month. This basket has several things in it. The most important thing in this basket is housing. The typical household spends a fair bit of its income on housing, so we are looking at the prices of all things that go into making up housing. Your rent, your insurance, maintenance on your house, utilities, and stuff like that. So, because this is such an important consumer expenditure, the Consumer Price Index weights housing very heavily. That is, about 41% of all the CPI is made up of housing price changes. That's the most important component. The second most important component is food and beverages. That is, what does the typical household spend to eat and drink each month? Food and beverages account for about 17% of the total of the CPI, and that shows its relative importance as the government perceives it in household spending. The third component is transportation. That is, fuel, insurance, and maintenance and depreciation on vehicles. So transportation costs, which add up also to about 17% of the total, because they're important to households, get a large weight in the Consumer Price Index. Whenever transportation prices change, that feeds into the government's measure of the household's cost of living. The next component is medical care. And medical care accounts for about 7% of the total. This is the money that people are spending on doctors and medication and such like. So we'll mark 7% here to represent medical expenditures. Then we've got clothing. What are you paying to keep yourself warm and stylish? And clothing prices, also important in this index, get a weight of about 5 or 6%. And finally, entertainment. The government looks at how much you're spending on vacations, recreation, movies, and the like, and that adds up to about 4% of the total. That leaves a residual, what the government calls other goods and services, and other goods and services adds up to a total of about 7% to give us a nice round 100. So if you want to know what makes up the Consumer Price Index, here we've color-coded it for you. Housing, food and beverages, transportation, medical care, clothing, entertainment, and other. all the things that I care about. That is what I spend money on as a household each month. When the consumer price index changes, you're spending more or less depending on the direction of the change. A rise in the consumer price index means that the cost of the goods and services that you're typically buying is rising. That is, the cost of living is increasing. And the rate at which the cost of living increases tells the rate at which your salary has to increase if you're going to maintain your lifestyle. Now, how do we use the cost of living index? How do we use the CPI? Who is paying attention to it? Well, there are a couple of reasons why the CPI is important. The first is the CPI is actually figured into labor contracts. There are a lot of unions who negotiate their wages for 2 or 3 years out using the consumer price index as a measure of the cost of living. These contracts have cost of living adjustments built into them. So the union, the employees, and the employers all agree that they'll use the government CPI as the official measure of the cost of living. And when it rises, wages, by contract, rise along with it. Also, the Consumer Price Index determines the rate at which Social Security payments increase. That is, the cost of living adjustments built into Social Security payments look at the CPI as the official measure of the increase in the cost of living. So the CPI is something that people watch and actually build into their contracts as a measure of the cost of living. When it goes up, a lot of people's wages and Social Security payments go up automatically with it. Another reason you should pay attention to the CPI is the increase in the CPI is often used to measure what we call the real interest rate. The real interest rate is the return on your savings measured in terms of purchasing power. That is, how much extra purchasing power will you have next year if you put a certain amount away in the bank this year? If you put $100 in the bank this year, next year you'll have $110 if the interest rate is 10%. But how much of that is actually spendable money, and how much of it is just holding you even for the effects of inflation? Say the inflation rate is 4%. That means your savings has to grow at a rate of 4% just to keep your purchasing power constant, just to account for the increase in the cost of living. If the nominal interest rate is 10% and the inflation rate is 4%, that means 6% is the real interest rate. Beyond inflation, you're getting a 6% rate of return on your money that's actually coming out in terms of real goods and services that you can buy that you couldn't afford last year. So take the nominal interest rate, subtract the rate of inflation, perhaps measured by the CPI, and what's left over is the real interest rate. The real interest rate is what households pay attention to when they decide whether they're going to save money or not. When the inflation rate is high and the nominal interest rate isn't high enough to compensate for it, I'm not going to save my money. Why let it sit and rot in the bank? Why let it sit and my purchasing power shrink? No, I'm going to spend money today. But when the real interest rate is high, I see that it's worth my while to delay consumption. And I put the money in the bank and I enjoy more purchasing power in the future. Now, there are all kinds of price indices. We focused in this discussion on the Consumer Price Index. The Consumer Price Index looks only at a subset of all the goods and services available in the economy. But it's the subset that a consumer cares most about: food, clothing, housing, entertainment, medical care. Another index that we can consider is the Producer Price Index. It's a broader index. It includes a lot of other stuff. And it includes the prices that are important to producers and their profits. It includes the price of aluminum, the price of electricity, the price of all kinds of raw materials and other inputs that go into the production of the goods and services that consumers buy. The Producer Price Index includes a lot more stuff. And it should be important to you if you're trying to make predictions about what's going to happen to your own cost of living in the future. That is, if producer prices are rising today, it won't be long before producers, trying to protect their profits, have to pass those rising costs on to you in the form of higher consumer prices. That's why we call the Producer Price Index a leading economic indicator. It points toward what's going to happen to your own cost of living in the future. Each of these cost indices, whether it's the Consumer Price Index, whether it's the Producer Price Index, whether it's the GDP deflator, each of them is designed to answer a particular question. We've talked about the Consumer Price Index. It's trying to answer the question, what's happening to the cost of living as households perceive it? The Producer Price Index answers the question, what's happening to production costs, and what might happen to consumer prices down the road. Every index has its own question to answer. All told, they are indicators of inflation, the general rate at which prices are rising across the economy. Now, here's a mystery. On page 1 of the Wall Street Journal, the inflation rate is reported at 2.5%. And on page 14 of the same day's journal, it says we've had 0% inflation for the last year. Now, how can both of these numbers be correct? Is there an error, or is there something I'm missing? Hold on. On page 1, it says that the 2.5% inflation rate is based on the GDP deflator. Whereas on page 14, it says that the 0% inflation rate is based on the Consumer Price Index. Now, I know that these two indexes are different, and maybe that accounts for the difference in their measures of inflation. After all, the Consumer Price Index measures only the prices of a subset of goods, goods that are purchased regularly by households, things like food and clothing, whereas the GDP deflator includes all of the goods and services produced in the economy. So, since the Consumer Price Index is based on the prices of fewer goods, maybe that's why the number is different than the inflation rate measured by the GDP deflator. However, it turns out that there's something else going on. What's going on is that even if the GDP deflator and the Consumer Price Index were based on exactly the same set of goods, you could get different numbers because of differences in the way in which the two indexes are calculated. I think I can make this point very clear with a simple example. Consider an economy that produces only two goods, food and clothing. We're choosing food and clothing because these are goods that consumers purchase. So the Consumer Price Index is based on the price of these goods. And since these are the only goods produced in the economy, the GDP deflator depends also only on the price of these two goods. Now let's look at the gross domestic product data for 2 consecutive years, the year 2000 and the year 2001. In the year 2000, 10 units of food are produced, and the price per unit is $10 for food. So $10 times 10 units is $100 worth of food production. Clothing, $20 per unit, times 10 units is $200 from clothing production. $200 plus $100 gives us a gross domestic product of $300 in the year 2000. Now, as we move to the year 2001, notice that two things have changed. First, the prices of goods have changed. Food is now selling for $20 a unit, and clothing for $35 a unit. The next thing that's changed is that quantities have changed. There's more food produced and more clothing produced. So the gross domestic product is going to be larger because prices are bigger and quantities are bigger. Let's go ahead and calculate the gross domestic product for the year 2001. $20 per unit of food times 15 units of food gives us a GDP from food of $300. Over here, under clothing, we've got $35 a unit times 15 units for $525 worth of clothing produced. 525 plus 300 gives us a gross domestic product for the year 2001 of $825. Now, I'm interested in what's happening to prices between the year 2000 and the year 2001. Now, since there are two different goods being produced, our overall measure of prices has got to be some kind of weighted average of the change in prices. And the way in which that weighted average is calculated is what distinguishes the Consumer Price Index from the GDP deflator. Let's look first at the method used in calculating the Consumer Price Index. The intuition behind the Consumer Price Index is, how much would you have to pay to get the same goods you got last year at this year's prices? So we're using the quantities from last year, but the prices from this year. Let's look then at how the Consumer Price Index is calculated. The question is, what would it cost you to buy last year's goods at this year's prices? So let's look first then at that amount of money that you'd have to spend. What I'm going to do is take the quantities from the year 2000 and move them forward to the year 2001 and calculate the spending I would have to do at 2001 prices in order to buy the year 2000 quantities. So in the year 2001, food is now $20 a unit. $20 a unit times the original 10 units of food that we were buying last year is $200 you're going to have to spend to get the same food that you were buying last year. What about clothing? Last year, you had 10 units of clothing. So this year, when you have to pay $35 a unit for clothing, you're going to have to spend $350 to get the same amount of clothing that you had last year. So $350 on clothing, $200 on food gives us a grand total of $550 that you have to spend in the year 2001 when prices are higher to get the same goods that you were buying back in the year 2000. Now, let's calculate the consumer price index. The consumer price index is a ratio. It's a ratio of the amount of money that you'd have to spend this year to get that basket relative to how much you have to spend in the base year, the year whose quantities you're considering. So let's calculate 550, the amount we have to spend in the year 2001, divided by 300, the amount we had to spend in our base year, the year 2000. Multiply that by 100, and you get the consumer price index, which in this case is 183. So the consumer price index for the year 2001 is 183. That's the amount that you would, the amount by which prices have increased from one year to the next. But we're interested in a percentage increase, the amount by which prices have increased in percentage terms, because that's the inflation rate. So what we do to calculate the inflation rate using this method is we take the consumer price index for the year 2001, and we subtract from it the consumer price index from the year 2000. Now, the year 2000 is our base year, remember, where it cost $300 to buy that basket of goods and services. So divide 300, which is the amount you have to spend in the year 2000, by 300, which is the amount you have to spend in the base year, and you get 100. The CPI for the base year, by definition, is always 100%. It's equal to itself. So subtract 100 from 183. So this is the CPI for the year 2001 minus the CPI for the year 2000, the base year, and divide by the base year amount, which is 100, and that's going to give us the rate of inflation. 183 minus 100 is 83, divided by 100 is equal to 83%. The rate of inflation measured according to the method of the CPI is 83%. The CPI has increased by 83% from the year 2000 to the year 2001. The price of that market basket of goods and services has gone up by 83%. That's the inflation rate measured with this method. Now, let's look at the other method for calculating the inflation rate. This one is based on the GDP deflator. Remember, the GDP deflator is the ratio between the nominal GDP in a particular year and the real GDP for that same year. The way you calculate the real GDP, you remember, is to find the value of the goods and services produced in a particular year using the market prices from the base year. So the nominal GDP for the year 2001 is 550, but the real GDP is calculated using the year 2000 prices. So let's go ahead and put the year 2000 prices into our equation and use the year 2001 quantities. So this means that the real GDP for the year 2001 is $10 times 15 units of food, or 150, plus $20 times 15 units of clothing, or 300. 300 plus 150 gives us a real gross domestic product of $450. Now, to find the GDP deflator, take the nominal GDP and divide by the real GDP, and this should give us then, after we multiply by 100, some notion of, on average, how much prices have risen between the year 2000 and the year 2001. And the answer is 122. So 122 is the GDP deflator for the year 2001. To calculate the inflation rate now, we have to see how the GDP deflator has changed between the 2 years. So we now want to do a percentage change calculation. So let's do that. 122 is the GDP deflator for the year 2001. What's the year 2000 GDP deflator? Well, it's the base year. So in the base year, the GDP deflator is always going to be 100% because you're comparing that year with itself. So subtract 100 from 122 and divide by 100, and that's going to give us an inflation rate of 22%. So using the GDP deflator method, we get an inflation rate of 22%. Now, why the difference? The difference is because the Consumer Price Index looks at the change in the cost of a particular bundle of goods and services. That is, it uses the current production at the new prices. The GDP deflator, on the other hand, uses the new production at the old prices. And because you're using a different method to calculate the two indexes, it shouldn't be surprising that we wind up with different numbers for the rate of inflation. Now, notice here we've done a very, very, very simple example with only two particular goods, both of them being consumer goods, and with some pretty extreme changes in prices and quantity. I mean, in the U.S. economy right now, our inflation rate is much, much lower than 22% or 83%. So this is an entirely hypothetical example. The point of this hypothetical example is to show you that you get a different inflation rate when you are holding prices constant and changing quantities than when you're holding quantities constant and changing prices. The method of the CPI gives you a different inflation rate than the method of the GDP deflator. Now, typically, these methods will yield numbers that are not so far apart. And if we look at some actual data from history, you can see that the GDP deflator method of calculating the inflation rate has given numbers that were pretty close to the CPI method for calculating the inflation rate. Some years, the CPI is going to give you a bigger inflation rate than the GDP deflator. And some years, the GDP deflator method is going to give you a higher rate of inflation. It all depends on how the base numbers, the quantities, are changing relative to the prices. Mathematically, we could go into when this number is going to be a bigger change and when this number is going to be a bigger change. But that's not as important as you're understanding the basic method of calculating the inflation rate using these two distinct methods. Both of them are trying to answer the same question. How fast are prices rising? But because they use different approaches to answering that question, they sometimes wind up with different numbers as their answer. In macroeconomics, the economy is an organism. Rather than the micro approach, where we analyze the cells, in macro we're looking at the whole animal. And if the economy is an organism, then these are its vital signs. Look here at a graph of the business cycle. On the horizontal axis, we measure the flow of time. On the vertical axis, we look at changes in real GDP around a trend. That is the rate of change of real GDP. And look what you see. Expansion and bust. Boom and recession. And here, like riding on a roller coaster, the economy expands and contracts going up and down over time. Well, immediately you've got lots of questions. Why do we have these sharp spikes of boom? And why do we have these very large declines? What causes the business cycle? And what causes it to be very severe in some periods of history and more muted in others? In order to discuss the business cycle in detail, we have to have common vocabulary, and that's where we'll begin. How do you describe a business cycle? Let's begin with a graph. On the horizontal axis, we'll put time, the flow of time. And on the vertical axis, we'll put real gross domestic product, the actual physical goods and services produced by the economy in a year. Now, one of the things that happens over time is that technological progress and the growth of the labor force and the capital stock make an economy more productive. That is, what an economy is capable of producing tends to increase over time through the natural processes of growth. So we can begin by putting a trend line in this picture. That is, over time, if left to itself, the economy would tend to expand. That is, its capacity for production would grow larger and larger. So here's a trend line. This is what would happen if the economy were just growing on its own smoothly. But the economy never grows smoothly. Things happen. An oil price shock feeds into the mix. Businesses facing higher fuel costs lay off workers and produce less. And those workers with less income to spend stop buying things so that other stores are unable to sell their products and other factories shut down. Then when people start saving money, businesses are able to buy capital at lower interest rates, businesses begin to expand again, and the economy starts to grow. Like any organism, there's this kind of fluctuation or breathing or pulsing. The economy does not grow in the nice, smooth expansion of the trend line. Rather, it fluctuates around the trend line, sometimes growing faster than the trend line in what we call a boom or an expansion. Then, after a peak is reached, some event causes the economy to turn downward, growing less rapidly, or actually contracting in a recession. And then a trough is reached, and the economy begins to expand again. Expansion, peak, recession, trough, expansion, and the business cycle unfolds, snaking around the trend line. Let's make sure that we're clear on the definitions of the terms that we'll use throughout our discussion of business cycles. An expansion is a period where gross domestic product is rising more rapidly than the trend. An expansion is usually a period where business is booming and where employment is increasing. Maybe the unemployment rate itself is shrinking, or the number of jobs being created is rising rapidly. An expansion is called a boom if it's especially strong, that is, if the slope of the curve is especially steep. An expansion or a boom ends at its peak. At this point, the economy is now turning downwards. What causes it to turn downwards? Sometimes the economy is simply overheated. It's grown so rapidly that the price of some raw materials is beginning to rise. There is inflation in producer prices. The Federal Reserve, trying to prevent general inflation, will then tighten the money supply, making credit harder to get and making businesses unable to keep up the pace of expansion. So we reach this peak at which the economy is now going to begin to deflate. When the economy begins to expand less rapidly, or actually to contract, we slip into a recession. A recession used to be defined as 2 consecutive quarters of negative real GDP growth. But now, in general, a recession just means a period of significantly slower growth. And especially if that period of slower growth lasts 6 months or more, everyone agrees that we're in a recession. A recession is a period where unemployment may be rising, or certainly the rate at which new jobs are created has slowed. Sometimes during the recession, prices will actually fall, but usually a recessionary period is one where inflation is much, much less of a problem. Price pressure is off because businesses are not expanding rapidly. The recession ends at its lowest point, which is a trough. A trough is a point where the curve has hit bottom, and now we're ready to begin another expansion. And the process just goes on and on. Expansion, peak, recession, trough, expansion, and so forth. Right now, as we are planning this particular lesson, the United States economy has entered its 108th month of continuous expansion, the longest in U.S. history. This is being driven by a lot of factors, particularly rapid technological change and general boom in the world economy. A depression, like the U.S. suffered in the 1930s, is a recession that is especially long and deep. There's no good scientific definition for what a depression is, but everybody seems to know when we're in one. And the 1930s was the last real depression that we've suffered. But a depression could come again anytime the economy contracted for a long period of time into an especially low trough. So, we have a cyclical nature of our economy. As the economy booms, we tend to see diminishing unemployment, rapid job creation, rising prices, rising interest rates, until finally we reach a peak. At this point, the economy slips into a contraction or recession. Price pressure is off. There are not as many jobs created, and unemployment begins to rise. Then we reach the trough, and the economy begins to expand again, sometimes with the help of government policy. So why should we care then about this business cycle? Well, in periods of recession, there are severe costs imposed on our economy. Recessions have social costs, like increases in alcoholism, increases in domestic violence and divorce. Many social problems are exacerbated when the economy is having trouble. However, there are some good things that actually come from a recession. During periods of recession, when people are laid off of work, it gives them an incentive and an opportunity to seek work elsewhere. Usually businesses lay off their least productive workers whose skills are least well suited to their particular industry in a period of downturn. This then frees those workers to look for more productive employment in other sectors. So there's an efficiency gain during recessions to having people reallocated to other jobs. Another thing that happens is a recession is good for your trade balance. People don't tend to import as many goods when the economy is slipping into recession because household incomes are lower and people are buying less of everything, including imported goods. It also tends to reduce the inflation rate whenever there is a recession. And those firms that are less efficient get pushed out of the market, and their capital can be re-employed in other industries. Let's look one more time at the historical diagram that we began with. In this historical diagram, we can see the business cycle over the last 140 years. We see periods like the Civil War, where the mobilization of the economy for wartime created a rapid rise in the real gross domestic product, around 6% annual growth rate. We see the recovery of 1895, which followed the panic of 1893. The panic itself created a recession, but then the economy boomed during 1985. World War I was an occasion for rapid economic growth as the economy mobilized for war. And the Great Depression, which followed the crash of the stock market and tight money in the United States, was a period of extraordinarily low GDP growth, in fact, large negative numbers. But the economy largely recovered during World War II, whenever all of our resources were brought to bear on the war effort. The Vietnam War was a period of boom when prices and employment rose rapidly in the United States. But ever since the Great Depression and World War II, government policy has tended to create a less severe business cycle than we experienced in the years before very active policy. That is, one of the things we're going to study in macroeconomics is how government policy can mute the business cycle, leading to lower highs and less severe lows. That is, fiscal policy, government spending, and monetary policy, the action of the Federal Reserve, can give us a business cycle that's a little bit less like a roller coaster and a little bit more like the ordinary country roads that we'd rather drive on. So, as we continue our study of macroeconomics, we'll be looking at recessions and booms, troughs and peaks, and the trend of the economy in response to technological progress and growth in more detail. We'll be looking at this historical picture. We'll be looking at the story of the U.S. economy under a microscope to try to understand what causes highs and lows, ups and downs.